They fired me 6 minutes into my first day back. No onboarding. Just security and a script. What they did not know was that the woman they were escorting out owned 72% of the company and had already signed the document erasing half the C-suite. By the time the CEO's new daughter-in-law finished her victory post, her title was legally void. This is how getting fired became the most expensive mistake this family ever made. My name is Brooklyn Ross. I was sitting in the glass-walled fishbowl they called Executive Office 402, trying to remember if my password required a special character or just a capital letter. The IT department had sent me a temporary login credential that looked like someone had mashed their forehead against a keyboard, and I was carefully pecking it into the login field for Slack. It was my first day back in the building. Technically, the offer letter said I was returning as an executive advisor, a title that usually implies you are there to shake hands and look wise while the young wolves tear the meat off the bone. I was fine with that interpretation. I had spent 2 decades building the skeleton of this beast. I did not need to be the one hunting for its dinner anymore. I never got to hit enter. The heavy glass door did not just open, it was pushed inward with a performative sort of urgency. I stopped typing and kept my hands hovering over the keyboard, my eyes shifting from the blinking cursor to the small army invading my 3 minutes of solitude. It was a classic corporate firing squad. There were 2 security guards who looked like they would rather be literally anywhere else, a junior HR representative whose cheap suit was already sweating through the armpits, and leading the charge, the newly minted Chief Vision Officer, Brielle Lockwood. She was the CEO's daughter-in-law, a 26-year-old influencer who had pivoted to business leadership approximately 5 months ago, right after marrying Dylan Lockwood. She walked in holding an iPad like it was a riot shield. She did not look me in the eye. In fact, she seemed to be looking at a spot on the wall about 6 inches above my left ear. She did not offer a handshake. She did not offer a hello. She just tapped the screen of her tablet, took a breath that was clearly practiced in a mirror, and began to read. I watched her. I did not listen to the words immediately because I knew the script better than she did. I had written the original draft of that termination script 15 years ago to protect the company from wrongful termination lawsuits. It was dry, legally binding, and completely devoid of soul. Hearing it come from her mouth was a surreal experience. Instead of panicking, I found myself focusing on the absurdity of the details. There was a smear of terracotta-colored lipstick on the rim of her oat milk latte cup, which she was clutching in her left hand as if it were a source of power. It was sloppy. It showed a lack of attention to detail. Then my eyes drifted to the laptop tucked under her arm. It was the new, ultra-thin model with the titanium chassis. I remembered rejecting the budget request for those laptops 6 months ago because the ROI was non-existent, and the marketing team just wanted them because they looked pretty in coffee shop meetings. Clearly, my veto power had expired before I even swiped my badge this morning. Brielle cleared her throat, raising her voice slightly to ensure the security guards could hear her authority. Effective immediately. Your engagement with Halcyon Meridian Tech is terminated, she recited, her voice lacking any real inflection. Security will escort you out of the building. Please surrender your badge and any company property currently in your possession. Your personal effects will be mailed to your home address on file. The room went silent. The air conditioning hummed. A low drone that usually faded into the background, but now sounded like a jet engine. Behind her, the junior HR associate was trembling. He was holding a manila folder against his chest with white knuckles. I could see his eyes darting from me to the tablet in Brielle's hand and back to me. He knew. He had probably pulled my file up on the system before coming up here. He had seen the tag next to my name. Ross, Brooklyn, Advisory, Founder Status. He knew that you do not just walk into this office and read a script to someone with my clearance level. He wanted to speak. I saw his mouth open slightly, a warning dying in his throat, but fear won out. He clamped his mouth shut and stared at his shoes. I did not stand up immediately. I did not scream. I did not ask why. I simply looked at Brielle, who was finally risking a glance downward to see if I was crying yet. I reached up to my lapel and unclipped my security badge. It was an old one. issued before they rebranded to the sleek, minimalist logo they use now. The photo on it was from 20 years ago, back when I had dark circles under my eyes and cheap haircuts. I placed the plastic rectangle on the mahogany desk with a soft click. "Then we should do this by the book," I said. My voice was steady, quieter than hers, which seemed to unsettle her more than if I had shouted. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. I picked up my purse, which was the only personal item I had brought with me. I had not even had time to unpack a pen. "Tell your father-in-law that the emergency board session in 3 hours should be enlightening," I added. Brielle blinked. The script on her iPad did not have a response for that. She looked confused, her perfectly arched brows knitting together. "Board session?" she asked, breaking character for the first time. "There is no board session." I walked around the desk, moving past her. She had to step back to avoid touching me. I stopped right next to the trembling HR associate and gave him a small, pitying nod. "Check your email," I whispered to him. I walked out of the glass office and into the corridor. The security guards fell in step behind me, flanking me like I was a high-risk prisoner. We walked past the open-plan workspace where hundreds of young developers and marketing strategists were glued to their screens. A few heads turned. They saw the security escort. They saw the empty desk left behind. They whispered. I could feel their eyes on my back, the speculation starting to spread like a virus on the internal chat channels. "Did you see that? Who was she? Why was security escorting her?" We reached the lobby. It was a cathedral of glass and steel, designed to intimidate anyone who walked in. The massive LED wall behind the reception desk was cycling through the company values: innovation, integrity, vision, family. Family. That one almost made me laugh out loud. I walked past the reception desk, where the young woman who had greeted me 10 minutes ago with a bright welcome back, Ms. Ross, now hurriedly pretended to be busy on the phone, refusing to make eye contact. The Halcyon Meridian Tech logo pulsed on every screen, a blue and silver beacon of the empire I had constructed from a garage in Riverside Heights. My name was nowhere on these walls. If you looked at the website, you would see Graham Lockwood's face. You would see Dylan's face. You would now see Brielle's face under the title Chief Vision Officer. I was the ghost in the machine. I was the person who cleaned up the legal messes, who structured the debt, who fired the people Graham was too cowardly to face, who buried the bodies so the Lockwood family could keep their hands clean. They thought I was just an employee. They thought 20 years of service meant I was loyal to the point of stupidity. They thought they could erase me with a script and a security guard, because I had spent 2 decades standing in the shadows so they could shine in the light. To anyone watching, this looks like a tragedy. You are seeing a middle-aged woman getting kicked to the curb by the shiny new generation. You are feeling that pang of sympathy for the underdog. The loyal worker discarded like trash. You are probably thinking about how unfair it is, how cruel the corporate world can be. But I need you to stay in your seat. Do not leave yet. Do not close the tab. Because while it looks like I'm losing, you need to understand one thing about me. I do not play games unless I have already rigged the deck. I want you to sit here with me until the very last minute. I want you to watch the clock. Because right now, Brielle thinks she has won. She is probably drafting a LinkedIn post about making tough leadership decisions. What she does not realize is that when I walked out of that office, I did not leave my power behind. I left a time bomb, and the timer is already ticking down. The security guard pushed the revolving door open for me. "Have a nice day, ma'am," he said, sounding genuinely apologetic. I stepped out into the cool morning air. The city noise rushed in to meet me: sirens, traffic, the hum of life moving on. I turned back to look at the building one last time. The glass reflected the sky, hiding everything inside. As the revolving door sealed shut behind me, cutting off the air-conditioned silence of the lobby, the timeline shifted. Inside the building, on the 23rd floor, inside the pockets of 7 different board members across 3 different time zones, a notification sound pinged simultaneously. Screens lit up in the darkness of pockets and briefcases. Subject: emergency board notice. Mandatory attendance, 11 in the morning. The game had just begun, And they did not even know the pieces were moving. To understand why they underestimated me today, you have to understand where we started 20 years ago. Halcyon was not a glass tower in the financial district back then. It was not a brand that appeared on the sides of Formula One cars or in the background of tech influencer selfies. 2 decades ago, Halcyon was 2 folding chairs, a folding table that wobbled if you breathed on it too hard, and a server that smelled like burning plastic and stale pizza, all shoved into a garage in a suburb called Riverside Heights. It was hot. I remember the heat more than anything else. It was the kind of heat that stuck your shirt to your back and made it hard to think. But Graham Lockwood did not seem to notice. He was 24 years old, buzzing with caffeine and the manic energy of a man who believed he was about to change the world. He was a genius. I will give him that. He could code in his sleep and talk a venture capitalist out of their watch. But he was completely blind when it came to numbers. He looked at a balance sheet and saw squiggly lines. He looked at tax compliance and saw a suggestion rather than a law. I was 26. I was a forensic auditor working for a mid-sized firm that treated me like a calculator with legs. I was bored, underpaid, and tired of wearing gray suits to stare at gray walls. I had been hired as a contractor to clean up the books for 3 months so Graham could secure his Series A funding. He called it a little housekeeping. Within 48 hours, I realized it was not housekeeping. It was a crime scene cleanup. The company was a gold mine, but it was being run like an underground casino. Revenue was being booked before contracts were signed. Payroll was coming out of personal accounts. There were 3 different sets of projections, and none of them matched reality. But beneath the chaos, the product was brilliant. The code was revolutionary. I saw the future in that smelly garage, and I saw that Graham was going to crash it into a wall before it ever got off the ground. I spent 3 weeks not sleeping. I reconstructed the ledger from scratch. I categorized every expense, legitimized every revenue stream, and built a financial model that actually made sense. When I presented it to him, Graham looked at the binder like I had just handed him a holy text. He offered me a job on the spot. "You are a wizard," he told me, his eyes wide. "I want you to stay. Be my VP of Finance. I will give you a salary double what you are making now. I will give you a corner office once we move out of here." He was so proud of the offer. He thought he was handing me the world. $50,000 more a year and a title that sounded important. Most people would have taken it. Most people would have shaken his hand, taken the cash, and bought a nicer car. But I was already looking at the long game. I looked around that garage. I looked at the server that was humming with the code that would eventually run half the logistics networks in the country. I knew that salary was a trap. A salary makes you an employee. Employees are expendable. Employees can be fired. I pushed the contract back across the wobbly table. "I do not want the money, Graham," I said, "and I do not want the VP title." He looked confused. "Then what do you want?" "I want equity," I said. "I want stock options, and I want a percentage of the company in exchange for my services, instead of cash." He laughed. It was a nervous laugh. He thought I was crazy to turn down guaranteed cash for a slice of a company that might go bankrupt in a month. "You want paper?" he asked. "You want shares in a company that barely exists?" I looked him dead in the eye. "I would rather own the foundation than argue over which floor I sit on," I told him. He smiled then. He thought he was getting a steal. He thought he was saving cash flow by paying me in worthless stock. He grabbed a pen and signed the agreement without even reading the vesting schedule I had drafted. That was the first mistake he made. Over the next 2 decades, I did not just work for Halcyon, I became its immune system. And every time the company got sick, I extracted a price for the cure. 5 years in, we were preparing for our initial public offering. It was supposed to be Graham's coronation, but 3 days before the roadshow, a diligence team found a massive hole in our intellectual property rights. A former contractor was claiming he owned the core algorithm. The IPO was dead in the water. Graham was hyperventilating in the bathroom. I fixed it. I flew to Seattle, met with the contractor, and negotiated a settlement that sealed the rights forever. But before I boarded the plane, I had Graham sign an addendum granting me another 1.5% of the company as a performance bonus. He signed it with shaking hands, just grateful the problem was going away. 3 years later, the Securities and Exchange Commission came knocking. Someone in sales had been too creative with revenue recognition in Europe. It was the kind of investigation that ends with executives in handcuffs. I spent 6 months living in conference rooms, shredding nothing but reconstructing everything to prove intent was absent. I negotiated a fine instead of criminal charges. I saved the company from being delisted. The price? Another 1% equity. Then came the internal rot. Graham had started the company with 2 other friends and an uncle who provided the seed money. The friends were burnouts who wanted to party. The uncle was using the company accounts to hide money from the IRS. One by one, they needed to go. And one by one, I was there to facilitate their exit. When the co-founder quit because he was bored, I bought his shares privately. When the CFO went through a nasty divorce and needed liquid cash immediately to settle with his ex-wife, I was the only one with the liquidity and the willingness to buy his stake quietly. Without spooking the market, I bought him out at 30 cents on the dollar. When Graham's uncle got caught up in a tax scandal and needed to disappear from the capitalization table to save the company's reputation, I was the trash compactor. I absorbed his entire holding into a trust managed by me. Graham watched all of this happen, but he never really saw it. To him, I was just solving problems. He was the visionary, standing on stages, giving TED Talks about the future of connectivity. He was too busy being famous to look at the shareholder registry. He assumed that because he was the face of the company, he was the owner of the company. Meanwhile, I was building a fortress. I set up a complex network of trusts in Delaware. I layered them so that my name did not appear on the top line of every document. But the voting rights all flowed back to one person, me. I secured digital signature authority for every major corporate entity. I made myself the primary administrator for our compliance software, our investor relations portal, and our banking covenants. I deliberately refused the C-suite titles. Every time Graham offered to make me Chief Operating Officer or Chief Financial Officer, I declined. Too much visibility, I would say. I can work better from the shadows. Let me just be the executive advisor. Let me be special counsel. It fed his ego. He liked being the only chief in the room. He liked thinking I was just a helper, a consigliere who served at his pleasure. He did not understand that by refusing the title, I was removing a target from my back. When shareholders got angry, they called for the CEO's head. When profits dipped, they blamed the CFO. No one ever demands the resignation of an advisor. An advisor is furniture. An advisor is part of the walls. And you do not fire the walls until today. The culmination of my work happened 3 years ago. On a rainy Tuesday night, the office was empty. The cleaning crew was vacuuming the carpets in the hallway. By this point, the headquarters was a palace. We had art on the walls worth more than that entire garage in Riverside Heights. I walked down the corridor lined with black and white portraits of the Lockwood family. There was Graham, looking visionary. There was his son Dylan, looking expensive and vacant. There was even a picture of Graham's golden retriever. It was a shrine to their ego. I walked past all of them and into my office. It was small compared to theirs. It was functional. No art, no views of the skyline, just floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets and a secure terminal. I sat down and pulled up a document I had been drafting for months. It was a routine amendment to the shareholder bylaws, a boring stack of paper intended to modernize our governance structure. Buried in the middle of page 42, amidst paragraphs about meeting quorums and dividend distribution protocols, was a clause I had written myself. It was phrased in dense, boring legalese. It looked like standard boilerplate about emergency succession. But if you knew how to read it, really read it, it was a trap door. I signed the document with my digital key. Then I walked it down the hall to Graham's office. He was packing his bag for a golf trip to Scotland. He was laughing on the phone with his new fiancée. "Just some housekeeping, Graham," I said, placing the document on his desk. "We need to update the bylaws for the new fiscal year. Standard compliance stuff." He did not even sit down. He stayed standing. phone pressed to his ear, and scribbled his signature on the line I pointed to. "Thanks. Brooklyn," he said into the phone, not talking to me. "Yeah, I will be there by morning." He signed away his kingdom between a joke and a chuckle. I took the document back to my office. I scanned it. I uploaded it to the secure server. I locked the original in my safe. That night, I sat alone in my small office while the rain hit the glass. Down the hall, the portraits of the Lockwood family seemed to be smiling at me, smug and secure in their legacy. They thought they owned this place because their names were on the door. I looked at the signature on the page. I looked at the percentage points in my ledger that now totaled over 72%. I did not smile. I did not laugh. I just turned off the light and went home. I knew a storm was coming eventually. I knew the children would grow up and get hungry. I knew the new wives would want to redecorate. I knew one day they would try to remove the furniture. And I knew exactly what would happen when they tried. Time has a way of eroding things that seem permanent. It wears down mountains, it rusts steel, and it softens the sharp edges of men like Graham Lockwood. As Halcyon Meridian Tech expanded from a garage operation into a global behemoth, Graham changed. The nervous, brilliant coder who used to sleep under his desk was replaced by a man who enjoyed the sound of his own legend a little too much. He started believing the magazine covers. He started believing that the company's success was due to his magnetic personality rather than the ruthlessly efficient operational machine I had built beneath him. As he aged, a new anxiety took hold of him. It was not about bankruptcy or market share anymore. It was about legacy. He became obsessed with the idea of a dynasty. He wanted the name Lockwood to mean something, like Ford or Rockefeller. He wanted his bloodline to inherit the throne. Unfortunately, the bloodline consisted of his son, Dylan. Dylan was a nice enough boy when he was 12, but he had grown into a man who thought he hit a triple every time he was born on third base. He had no interest in the mechanics of the business. He only cared about the stock price and how it funded his lifestyle. And then, Dylan got married. Enter Brielle. Brielle was a force of nature. If that nature was a perfectly curated Instagram feed, she was an influencer who had decided, upon marrying Dylan, that she was actually a serious businesswoman. She pivoted her personal brand from travel and lifestyle to female empowerment and corporate leadership overnight. Graham, desperate to keep his son close and believing that Brielle brought a modern touch to the company, appointed her as the Chief Vision Officer. I will never forget the day she arrived at the headquarters. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was standing on the mezzanine looking down at the lobby when the revolving doors spun to admit her. She was wearing a pristine white dress that looked more suitable for a yacht party than a board meeting. She was holding her phone out at arm's length, talking to the screen as she walked. "Hey guys," she was saying to her 2 million followers, "it is my first day as Chief Vision Officer at a billion-dollar tech giant. We are going to shake things up. We are going to bring so much energy to this space. Stay tuned." She did not look at the receptionist. She did not look at the security guards. She just walked through the lobby like she owned the air she was breathing. The first executive meeting was a disaster. Though nobody else seemed willing to admit it, we sat in the main boardroom, the one with the view of the entire city. Graham sat at the head of the table, beaming like a proud father. Dylan sat on his right, checking his watch. Brielle sat on his left, her phone face up on the table, recording voice memos. I sat at the far end, near the door, my usual spot. Brielle did not waste time. She stood up and presented a slide deck that was 90% pictures and 10% buzzwords. "We need a total rebrand," she announced, gesturing to a mood board that featured a lot of pastel colors and abstract shapes. "Halcyon feels old. It feels heavy. We need to pivot to a narrative of lightness. We need to optically refresh the leadership." She paused then, and her eyes drifted down the length of the table. They slid past the VP of Engineering, past the General Counsel, and landed squarely on me. "We need leadership that fits the new era," she said, her voice sweet, but the intention razor-sharp. "We have too many people here who are stuck in the past. We need digital natives, not legacy caretakers." I saw the junior VP of sales shift uncomfortably in his seat. Everyone knew she was talking about me. I was the oldest person in the room besides Graham. I was the one who asked about compliance. I was the one who asked about budget caps. I was the barrier to their fun. I looked at Graham, expecting him to say something. I expected him to remind her that the legacy caretakers were the reason the lights were on, but Graham just nodded. He looked tired. He looked like a man who would agree to anything just to keep the peace at Sunday dinner. "That is an interesting perspective, Brielle," Graham said softly. "We certainly want to stay current." Dylan chimed in then, leaning forward. "Exactly. Dad, we need fresh blood. We cannot be run by people who think like auditors from the fax machine era. The market reacts to energy. It reacts to youth." He did not look at me when he said it, which was typical. Dylan had never been able to look me in the eye since I refused to approve his company credit card usage for a bachelor party in Vegas 5 years ago. I sat there and listened to them dismantle the dignity of the company I had saved from ruin a dozen times. I realized then what was happening. They were not interested in management. They were interested in performance. They wanted what I called glass office leadership. They wanted to be seen making decisions, to be seen pointing at whiteboards, to be seen firing people. They did not want to do the actual work of reading contracts or analyzing risk. They wanted the glory without the grit. And I was the grit. The meeting ended with no concrete decisions, but the atmosphere had shifted. The wolves were circling, and they had the CEO's blessing. 2 weeks later, I was working late. It was past 7 in the evening. The office was mostly dark. Save for the cleaning crews and the few workaholics who actually kept the engine running, I was in the executive lounge, making a cup of tea. I had left the lights off because I enjoyed the view of the city lights in the dark. I heard the click of heels on the marble floor of the hallway. Then I heard voices. It was Brielle and 2 of her friends, hangers-on, who had been given vague consulting titles in the marketing department. They walked into the lounge area, not seeing me in the shadows of the kitchenette. "Oh my God, the office is amazing," one of the friends squealed. "It is okay," Brielle's voice replied. "It is a bit dated, but I am changing that." She laughed, the sound echoing off the glass walls. "What about the old guard?" another voice asked. "That woman who stares at you in the meetings." Brielle sighed, a dramatic, exaggerated sound. "Brooklyn, she is gone. By the 3rd quarter. That old advisor will be history. I am going to streamline the whole leadership team. I told Dylan that I cannot work with negative energy. Dad-in-law already promised me he would sign off on it. He said I can build my own dream team." They laughed again. The sound of victory before the battle had even been fought. I stood there in the dark, my hand hovering over the button of the hot water dispenser. I did not press it. I did not want the noise to give me away. I just stood there and breathed. I should have been angry. I should have stormed out there and told her that she was standing on a floor I paid for, drinking coffee from a machine I leased, in a building I secured the mortgage for, but I did not feel anger. I felt a cold, clinical clarity. It was the same feeling I had 20 years ago when I looked at the chaotic books in the garage. It was the feeling of seeing a mess and knowing exactly how to clean it up. I waited until they left, their laughter fading down the corridor toward the elevators. I walked back to my office. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The glow of my computer monitors was enough. I sat down and unlocked my secure drive. I navigated through the folders: corporate governance, historical documents, shareholder agreements, amendments. I opened the file titled Amended Bylaws, 2015. I scrolled down. I did not need to search for it. I knew exactly where it was. Page 42. I stopped at Clause 27B. I had written this clause a decade ago. After Graham's nephew had tried to fire the entire legal team during a cocaine-fueled power trip, I had told Graham it was a safety mechanism to protect the company from unstable leadership. He had signed it because he was tired and wanted to go home. I read the words on the screen. They glowed white against the dark background. In the event a non-equity appointee terminates a corporate officer without a prior majority vote of the board of directors, all executive authority granted to said appointee shall be immediately suspended. Furthermore, Interim control of all executive functions shall revert automatically to the majority shareholder until a formal review can be conducted. I read it twice. Brielle was a non-equity appointee. She had 0 shares. Her husband had shares, but they were in a trust controlled by his father until he turned 40. She had no ownership. She was an employee with a fancy title. And she was planning to fire me. I checked the definition of corporate officer in the appendix. My name was listed there, explicitly, under my official title of special counsel. I looked at the calendar. It was May. She had said she wanted me gone by the 3rd quarter. That meant she would make her move soon. She would want to do it before the summer break, so she could enjoy her vacation feeling like a queen. I did not call a lawyer. I did not warn Graham. I did not confront Brielle. If I warned them, they would find a way around it. They would have the board vote properly. They would follow the procedure. No, for the trap to work, they had to be arrogant. They had to believe they were untouchable. They had to break the rules so egregiously that the consequences would be automatic and irreversible. I needed her to fire me. I needed her to do it wrongly. I needed her to do it publicly. I reached for a sticky note and wrote down the date and time of the conversation I had just overheard. I stuck it to the bottom of my monitor. Then I looked back at the screen, at the cursor blinking next to Clause 27B. In the event a non-equity appointee terminates a corporate officer, it was not just a sentence, it was a guillotine blade, hoisted high and waiting for someone to stick their neck out. I closed the laptop, I picked up my purse, I walked out of the office, leaving the door unlocked. Let them come. I thought, let the princess have her first day. I was already preparing for her last. To understand the weapon I was about to detonate, you have to understand the history of its assembly. Clause 27B was not born out of malice. It was born out of necessity, created in the wake of a disaster that almost sank us a decade ago. Back then, Graham had a nephew named Julian. Julian was 22, fresh out of business school, and convinced that he was the next Steve Jobs. Graham, in his infinite familial blindness, had given Julian a VP title and oversight of the legal department. It took Julian exactly 3 weeks to cause a catastrophe. In a fit of rage over a compliance report he did not understand, Julian tried to fire the entire legal team on a Friday afternoon. He shouted, he threw files, and he sent out termination emails that were legally actionable. I spent the entire weekend cleaning up the mess. I had to call every lawyer, offer retention bonuses, and apologize profusely to keep them from suing us for hostile work environment. The following Monday, I sat down with Arthur Sterling, a wizened corporate attorney from Boston who had been practicing law since before I was born. We sat in a small conference room with stacks of case law between us. "We need a kill switch," Arthur had said, his voice raspy from years of cigars. "We need a mechanism that stops these children from burning the house down when they get their hands on matches." Together, we drafted Clause 27B. We called it the nepotism shield in private, but on paper, it was buried under the heading Executive Termination Protocols. The language was specific and brutal. It stated that any termination of a corporate officer defined as anyone with C-level status or special counsel designation executed by an appointee who held 0 equity in the company must be preceded by a majority vote of the board of directors. That was the shield, but then we added the sword. The clause went on to specify the penalty for violation. If a non-equity executive attempted such a termination without board approval, their executive authority would be immediately suspended, not reviewed, not question suspended, but the real kicker was the fallback provision. In the event of such a suspension, interim control of the company would automatically revert to the majority shareholder until the board could convene. At the time, Graham thought the majority shareholder was him. He signed the amendment late one Tuesday night, rubbing his temples, exhausted from dealing with Julian's tantrums. "This will keep them in check," right, he had asked me, pen hovering over the paper. "This stops the kids from breaking things. It ensures stability." "Graham," I had replied, "it protects the company from ego." He signed it because he trusted me. He signed it because he wanted to sleep at night without worrying about which nephew was destroying which department. He never once considered that the definition of majority shareholder might change over time. But I did. Over the years, as I quietly bought out the co-founders, the ex-wives, and the scandalous uncles, my stake in Halcyon grew. It was a silent accumulation. I bought shares through blind trusts. I bought options that vested quietly. I bought distressed equity when the market dipped and everyone else was selling. I used different entity names, Aurora Holdings, Meridian Trust, Riverside Ventures, but they all led back to one beneficiary: me. By the time Brielle walked into the office with her rebrand strategy, I controlled 72.04% of the voting stock. I was not just an employee. I was the owner of the house she was trying to redecorate. The beauty of Clause 27B was that everyone in the Lockwood family had forgotten it existed. To them, the bylaws were just dusty paperwork filed away in a basement. They operated on the assumption that power came from the name on the door, not the fine print in the contract. But I remembered. I had the original document with the wet ink signature in my safe. I had the digital timestamp verified by a third-party server. And most importantly, I had access to the capitalization table, the master list of who owned what. I was the administrator. I knew exactly where the power lay. When I heard Brielle planning my exit, I did not panic. I went to work. For 3 nights leading up to my so-called first day back, I turned my home office into a war room. I printed out the full activation packet. It was a stack of documents 2 inches thick. First, the notice of activation, citing the specific violation of Clause 27B. Second, the proof of equity, a certified audit of the cap table showing my 72% stake. Third, the suspension order, legally stripping Brielle of her powers. Fourth, the assumption of control, declaring myself the interim executive authority. I drafted the emails. I set up the digital signatures. I prepared the notifications for the major investors and the external legal counsel. I made sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. I could have stopped it. I could have walked into Graham's office and showed him the clause. I could have told him, if she fires me, she destroys herself. He might have listened. He might have reined her in. But I did not want to stop it. I realized that if I warned them, they would just find another way to push me out. They would do it legally. They would hold a board meeting, whip the votes, and force me out with a golden parachute. They would win, because they would follow the rules I had written. So I had to let them break the rules. I had to let Brielle walk into that trap on her own 2 feet. I needed the violation to be so flagrant, so undeniable, that the legal mechanism would snap shut like a steel jaw. I needed them to commit the act. I watched the clock tick closer to the morning of my return. I slept soundly. On the morning of the firing, I woke up at 5. I made coffee. I dressed in my best suit not for the job I was supposedly starting, but for the job I was about to take. At 6:59 in the morning, 1 minute before I left my apartment, I sat at my desk. The physical documents were in my bag. The digital versions were queued on my secure server. I picked up my pen. It was a heavy fountain pen, a gift from Graham 15 years ago for saving the company from a tax audit. The irony was not lost on me. I signed the bottom of the Notice of 27B activation. The ink was black and permanent. I looked at the signature. It was not the signature of an advisor. It was the signature of an owner. They thought they invited me back, I said to the empty room, my voice cold and steady. I had never left. I closed the folder, put it in my briefcase, and walked out the door to go get fired. The clock on my phone read exactly 7 in the morning when I pressed the enter key on my laptop at home. It was a simple action, the kind of keystroke you make 100 times a day, but this one sent a digital signal that traveled out of my secure server and into the inboxes of 12 specific people. At the same exact moment, a dispatch order went out to a high-end courier service I had retained weeks ago. While I was putting on my coat and checking my reflection in the mirror, ensuring not a single hair was out of place, physical packets were being pulled from safe deposit boxes in 3 different cities. Each packet contained a certified copy of the Clause 27B violation notice, a current capitalization table, and a document titled A Notice of Emergency Board Session. At 7:42 in the morning, I stepped through the sliding glass doors of the Halcyon building. The air conditioning hit me with that familiar, sterile chill. The receptionist, a bright-eyed girl named Sarah, who had only been with the company for 6 months, looked up and beamed at me. "Welcome back, Ms. Ross," she chirped. "It is so good to see you." She had no idea. She did not know that the email titled Emergency Board Session had already landed in the inbox of the General Counsel, bypassing the usual filters, because my email address still had the highest level of clearance priority. She smiled at me, thinking I was there to advise the new regime. I smiled back, knowing I was there to dismantle it. Meanwhile, upstairs on the 23rd floor, the atmosphere was less welcoming. At 7:48, Brielle was pacing in her office. She was wearing a pastel pink power suit that looked like it had been tailored for a magazine shoot rather than a boardroom. She held the iPad with the termination script that the junior HR associate had prepared. "We do this fast," she was telling the terrified HR kid. "No chit-chat. No pleasantries. This is leadership. We rip the bandage off." She was psyching herself up. She was treating a corporate execution like a scene from a movie. She wanted to feel powerful. She wanted to feel decisive. She had no idea that the script she was memorizing was the trigger for a trap that had been set 10 years ago. At 7:54, I walked into the glass office. The firing happened exactly as I described it to you. It took 6 minutes. From the moment the door opened to the moment she said effective immediately, only 360 seconds passed. But while Brielle was reciting her lines, the world outside that room was moving at a very different speed. At the exact moment she told me security would escort me out, a courier in Midtown Manhattan was walking into the office of Harlan Price, the chairman of the board. Harlan was just sitting down to his morning coffee. The courier placed a thick, heavy envelope on his desk. Harlan frowned, put down his cup, and picked up a letter opener. At the exact moment I placed my badge on the table, another courier in Chicago was signing into the reception of our lead investor's firm. He handed a similar packet to the executive assistant, marking it urgent and confidential. And as I said my final words to Brielle, telling her to inform her father-in-law about the meeting, a third courier in Austin was delivering the final packet to our external legal audit team. The trap was not just local, it was geographic. It was everywhere. I walked out of the office. I took the elevator down. I walked through the lobby. At 8 o'clock sharp, the head of security, acting on Brielle's orders, logged into the building management system. He found the entry for Ross, Brooklyn. He clicked the drop-down menu and selected Terminated. The system processed the request. My badge was deactivated. The turnstiles would no longer open for me. But the security system was a surface-level program. It controlled doors and elevators. It did not control the soul of the company. Deep in the server room, in the encrypted database that housed the shareholder registry and the corporate governance protocols, a different reality existed. The entry for Ross. Brooklyn did not say terminated. It said voting control 72.04%, status active, role primary administrator. Brielle did not know the difference between a door lock and a corporate charter. At 8 and 5 minutes, Brielle sat down in her chair, feeling the rush of adrenaline. She pulled out her phone and opened Slack. She typed a message to the IT help desk channel. "Please deactivate all access for Brooklyn Ross. Full lockout, email, server, Slack, everything. Thanks." She added a smiling face emoji at the end. That emoji was the perfect summary of her incompetence. She was ordering a digital assassination with a smile. At 8:11, the request landed on the screen of Marcus, our IT director. Marcus was a good man. I had hired him 5 years ago. He saw the ticket come in from the chief vision officer. He sighed, took a sip of his energy drink, and opened the back-end registry to process the offboarding. He typed in my username. The profile loaded. Marcus stopped. He blinked. He leaned closer to the screen. Usually, when you pull up an employee profile to deactivate it, there is a simple button that says Deactivate User. But on my profile, that button was grayed out. Next to it was a shield icon indicating a system-critical dependency. Marcus scrolled down. He looked at the permissions list. Administrator for SEC Compliance Portal. Administrator for Investor Relations Gateway. Sole signatory for federal tax filings. Root access for legal document repository. Then he saw the line that made his blood run cold. Equity Class A, 72.04%. Marcus did not touch the keyboard. He knew enough about corporate structure to know that you do not simply delete the person who owns the majority of the building. He pushed his chair back, grabbed his laptop, and ran out of the IT room. He did not run to Brielle. He ran to the legal department. He burst into the office of the general counsel, a man named David who was currently staring at the email I had sent at 7 in the morning. "David," Marcus said, breathless, "I just got a ticket from Brielle to wipe Brooklyn's access." David looked up. His face was pale. He had the Clause 27B activation notice open on his screen. Marcus turned his laptop around and showed David the back-end registry. "If I deactivate her," Marcus said, pointing at the screen, "we lose legal signatures on everything: the compliance reports, the tax filings, the bank authorizations. The system is hard-coded to her credentials. If I delete her, the company effectively ceases to exist legally for about 48 hours until we re-verify everything." David looked at the screen. He looked at the number 72.04%. He looked at the suspension order on his own monitor. He looked Marcus in the eye and gave the most important order of his career. "Do not touch a single permission," David said. "Ignore the ticket. If Brielle asks, tell her the system is processing, but do not lock Brooklyn out. She is not just a user. Marcus, she is the system." At 8:30, the silence in the executive wing was heavy. In offices across the country, board members were reading the documents that had arrived by courier. They were reading the bylaws. They were realizing that the nice young woman who had just fired the company's oldest advisor had actually just suspended herself and handed total control to the very person she tried to remove. But inside Office 402, Brielle was oblivious. She had a bottle of champagne on her desk, a gift from Dylan. She poured a glass. She held it up against the morning light coming through the window. She took a photo with her phone. She spent the next 10 minutes swiping through filters, trying to find the one that made the gold bubbles look just right. She was crafting the caption in her head. Something about making hard choices and embracing the future. She posted the photo. First executive decision made. The caption read, "Cheers to the new era." She had no idea that outside her door, the new era was already over. The real meeting was set for 11 o'clock, and she was not invited to sit at the head of the table. While Brielle was busy filtering her victory selfie on the 23rd floor, Graham Lockwood was 30 miles away, standing on the immaculately manicured green of the fourth hole at the exclusive Pines Club. The sun was just cutting through the morning mist, and Graham was feeling excellent. He was wearing a crisp white polo and cream-colored trousers, looking every inch the retired statesman of the tech world. He was playing with two other CEOs from his era, men who had also passed the baton to their children or hired guns. Graham was in the middle of his backswing, lecturing them about the virtues of letting go. "You have to let the new blood take over," Graham said, lining up his shot. "The market wants energy. They want youth. My daughter-in-law, Brielle, she is a breath of fresh air. She understands the digital landscape in a way we never could." He swung. The club connected with a satisfying thwack, sending the ball soaring down the fairway. "She is going to modernize the whole operation," Graham added, watching the ball land perfectly. "A fresh wind. That is what we needed." His phone buzzed in the pocket of his golf bag. Graham frowned. He had a strict rule about phones on the course. He walked over to the cart, intending to silence it. He glanced at the screen. It was the general counsel. Graham rolled his eyes. "Lawyers," he muttered to his friends. "They probably want to know if they can change the font size on a disclaimer." He declined the call. He pulled his putter out of the bag. He was walking toward the green when the phone buzzed again, long, persistent vibrations against the leather of the bag. He checked it again. This time it was the chief financial officer. Graham sighed. Irritated now. Why were they bothering him? He had explicitly told them that today was a celebration day, a day for the new leadership to find their footing. He declined the call again. Let them figure it out, Graham said, laughing. That is why we pay them the big salaries, right? He lined up his putt. He took a breath. The phone rang a third time. This time, it was not a corporate number. The name flashing on the screen was Arthur Sterling. Arthur was Graham's personal counsel, a man who had been retired for 5 years and only called on birthdays or when someone had died. Graham froze. The putter lowered slowly. You do not ignore a call from Arthur Sterling. He picked up the phone. Hello. Arthur? Graham said, trying to keep his voice light. I am in the middle of a game. This better be. He stopped. He listened. The color drained from his face so fast, it looked like gravity had pulled the blood straight down into his cleats. His grip on the putter loosened. What do you mean? Activation, Graham whispered. He listened for another 10 seconds. The 2 other CEOs watched him, confused. They saw Graham's mouth open and close. They saw a bead of sweat roll down his temple, cutting through the sunscreen. Clause 27B. Graham stammered, That is impossible. That was hypothetical. She is an advisor. She cannot. He stopped again. The voice on the other end was cutting him off, delivering facts that hit him harder than a physical blow. Unauthorized termination. Majority shareholder. Immediate suspension of executive powers. Graham dropped the putter. It clattered onto the cart path, a jarring metal sound in the quiet morning. He did not pick it up. He did not say goodbye to his friends. He did not even grab his driver cover. I have to go, he said, his voice trembling. He jumped into the golf cart and slammed his foot on the accelerator, leaving his playing partners standing there in stunned silence. 40 minutes later, Graham's Aston Martin screeched to a halt in the VIP lane of the Halcyon headquarters. He threw the keys to a valet who looked terrified to see the boss covered in grass stains and mud splatters. Graham did not care. He ran through the lobby, ignoring the security guards who scrambled to salute him. He was a man who usually walked with a slow, deliberate gait, savoring his status. Now, he was running like a man whose house was on fire. He burst into the small conference room on the second floor, the crisis room usually reserved for data breaches or PR disasters. The room was cold. The air smelled of ozone and stale coffee. The entire legal team was there. The CFO was there. Arthur Sterling was on the speakerphone. On the table, spread out like an autopsy report, were the documents I had sent. Graham stopped at the head of the table, breathing hard, his hands gripping the back of a leather chair to steady himself. Tell me this is a mistake, Graham pleaded. Tell me she is bluffing. The general counsel, David, did not look up. He slid a document across the polished wood. It was the original shareholder agreement amendment from 10 years ago. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. It is not a bluff, Graham, David said quietly. It is ironclad. Graham picked up the document. He saw his own signature at the bottom, a scrawl he had made on a Tuesday night when he just wanted to go home. He read the text of Clause 27B. Any executive powers granted to non-equity appointees are suspended upon violation, with interim control reverting to the majority shareholder, Brooklyn Ross. Graham stared at the words. He read them again. Majority shareholder. He looked up, his eyes wide and desperate. How much does she hold now, he asked. The last time I checked, she had maybe 10% of his. The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the hard drives in the server rack in the corner. The CFO cleared his throat. He looked at a spreadsheet that had just been printed from the master registry. 72.04%, the CFO whispered. Graham felt his knees give way. He sank into the chair, the leather creaking under his weight. 72, Graham repeated, his voice barely audible. That is impossible. How? She bought out the co-founders, David explained, his voice devoid of emotion. She bought out your uncle. She bought out the distressed options from the 2008 crash. She did it through trusts. Aurora Holdings, Meridian Trust. They all roll up to her. We checked the chain of custody this morning. It is all legal. It is all filed. Graham put his head in his hands. He was trying to process the magnitude of the failure. He had spent 20 years thinking he was the king because he wore the crown. He had never looked at the floorboards to see who owned the castle. But she is just an advisor, Graham said, his voice cracking. It was a plea to the universe to restore the natural order of things. She sits in the small office. She fixes the contracts. She does not run the company. Arthur Sterling's voice crackled over the speakerphone, sharp and unforgiving. She owns it. Graham, there is a difference. Graham looked up. He looked around the room at the faces of the men and women he thought worked for him. He realized in that moment that they did not work for him. They worked for the corporation, and the corporation belonged to me. He stood up slowly, feeling like an old man. He walked to the window that overlooked the lobby atrium. Down below, 3 stories down, a massive poster was hanging from the ceiling. It was part of the campaign Brielle had ordered yesterday. It featured a black and white photo of Brielle, looking fierce and visionary, with the slogan, "A New Era of Leadership," printed in bold, modern font. Graham looked at the poster. He looked at the smiling face of the daughter-in-law he had championed, the fresh wind he had been bragging about on the golf course less than an hour ago. He realized that the wind had not just blown through the company, it had blown the roof off. The new era had been shot down before noon, and the gun was a paragraph he had signed and forgotten a decade ago. "Fix it," Graham whispered to the room, but he knew the answer before he even asked. "We cannot fix it," the general counsel said, closing the file. "The board meeting is in 2 hours, and according to the bylaws you signed, she is the chairwoman now." Graham pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He watched the employees moving around in the lobby, small ants in a colony he no longer controlled. He closed his eyes and waited for the elevator to bring the inevitable to his door. At 10:58 in the morning, the boardroom on the 23rd floor was a vacuum. Usually, these meetings were catered with an excess that bordered on obscene bagels from the best bakery in the city, artisanal coffee carafes, crystal pitchers of fresh juice. Today, the mahogany table was bare. There was no food. There was no coffee. There were only 12 bottles of room-temperature water and 12 thick, black binders placed with geometric precision at each seat. The blinds were drawn, filtering the mid-morning sun into a gray, clinical light. The air conditioning was set 2 degrees lower than usual, making the atmosphere feel less like a corporate strategy session and more like a tribunal. The board members were already seated. They were not chatting about their golf handicaps or their summer homes in the Hamptons. They sat in silence, hands clasped over the documents, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood table. Graham Lockwood sat near the head of the table, but not at it. He was slumped in his chair, still wearing his mud-splattered golf clothes, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in the last hour. His son, Dylan, sat next to him, shrinking into his Italian suit, his eyes glued to his phone screen as if the answer to his salvation was hidden in his Twitter feed. At 10:59, the double doors swung open. Brielle Lockwood walked in. She was a vision of misplaced confidence. She was wearing a cream-colored power suit that cost more than my first car, carrying a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She had touched up her makeup. She had practiced her smile. To her, this was the moment she solidified her reign. She thought she was walking into a coronation. "Good morning, everyone," she announced, her voice projecting with that practiced influencer brightness. "Sorry for the rush, but leadership waits for no one, right?" She did not notice the silence. She did not notice that no one smiled back. She did not notice that Graham did not look up to greet her. She walked straight toward the head of the table. It was the seat usually reserved for the chairman or the CEO. Today, it was empty. Brielle placed her portfolio on the table and reached for the back of the chair to pull it out. "Good afternoon," she said, correcting herself with a small, airy laugh. "Let us get started. I have some exciting updates on the—" You may observe from one of the side seats. A voice cut through the air. It was dry, brittle, and absolutely commanding. Brielle froze, her hand still touching the leather of the chair. She turned her head. Harlan Price, the chairman of the board, was looking at her over the rim of his spectacles. Harlan was 70 years old, a man who had survived 3 recessions and a federal indictment. He did not have patience for influencers. "Excuse me," Brielle asked, her smile faltering just a fraction. "That chair is reserved," Harlan said. "You may sit in the observer chairs against the wall, or you may stand, but you will not sit there." Brielle looked confused. She looked at Graham, expecting him to jump in, to laugh it off, to tell Harlan that the chief vision officer sits wherever she wants. But Graham was staring at his hands, picking at a loose thread on his polo shirt. "Reserved for who?" Brielle asked, a hint of irritation creeping into her voice. "I am the CVO. I called this meeting technically. Didn't I mean, after I made the executive decision to streamline the advisory role this morning." No one answered her. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Harlan nodded to David, the general counsel. David opened the black binder in front of him. The sound of the heavy cover hitting the table was loud in the quiet room. He did not look at Brielle. He looked at the paper. Per Clause 27B of the amended shareholder agreement, David read, his voice monotone. "Your appointment as Chief Vision Officer has been suspended pending shareholder review." Brielle blinked. She took a step back from the table, her hand dropping from the chair. "Suspended," she repeated. The word sounded foreign in her mouth. "You cannot suspend me. I just started. I just fired Brooklyn Ross this morning. I am in the middle of a restructure." David looked up then. His expression was not unkind, but it was entirely devoid of sympathy. It was the look a doctor gives a patient when the diagnosis is terminal. "Legally, you hold 0 equity. Mrs. Lockwood." David said, "Your authority is derivative. It flows from the board and the shareholders. Under the bylaws, a non-equity officer cannot terminate a corporate officer without a prior majority vote." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The termination you executed this morning was unauthorized." David continued, "It is void, and because you attempted it, the automatic suspension protocol has been triggered. You have no executive powers as of 7 o'clock this morning." Brielle's face went white. The perfectly applied blush stood out in stark contrast to her pale skin. She looked around the room, searching for an ally. She looked at the investors who had smiled at her at the Christmas party. They looked away. She looked at Dylan. "Dylan," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "Say something. They are trying to push me out." Dylan kept scrolling on his phone. He did not want to be part of the blast radius. She turned to Graham. "Dad," she pleaded, Tell them you approved the restructure. You said I could build my team." Graham finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. He looked at the young woman he had brought into the company, the woman he had thought was the future. He saw now that she was just a tourist in a world she did not understand. "I cannot do anything." "Brielle," Graham whispered, "it is the bylaws. I signed them." Brielle looked at him with betrayal, and then anger took over. She slammed her hand down on the table, right next to the water bottle. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Who even triggered that clause? I thought it was hypothetical." Dylan said those old rules did not matter anymore. Who dug this up? Harlan Price leaned back in his chair. He crossed his hands over his stomach. He looked at Brielle with a mixture of pity and disdain. "She did," Harlan said. Brielle frowned. "She who?" "The one you tried to fire," Harlan answered. The realization hit her like a physical slap. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. She looked at the 12 binders. She looked at the faces of the most powerful people in the company, and she realized they were not waiting for her. They were waiting for someone else. The side door of the boardroom opened. It was not a dramatic entrance. It was quiet. A young executive assistant walked in. She was carrying a small velvet bag. She walked past Brielle, who was standing frozen in the middle of the room. She walked to the head of the table, to the empty chair that Brielle had tried to claim. The assistant reached into the bag and pulled out a nameplate. It was heavy. It was made of solid brass with gold lettering. She placed it on the mahogany surface with a soft thud, positioning it perfectly in the center. The letters caught the overhead light. Brooklyn Ross, majority shareholder. The assistant stepped back and exited the room. The room remained silent. Graham closed his eyes. Dylan put his phone in his pocket, finally accepting that there was nowhere to hide. Brielle stared at the nameplate, reading the words over and over again, trying to make the math work in her head, trying to understand how an advisor with a small office could be the majority shareholder. She had walked in thinking she was the queen. She was just finding out she was trespassing in someone else's castle. Harlan Price checked his watch. 11 o'clock, he said. The double doors at the far end of the room began to open. At 10:59 in the morning, the heavy brass handle of the boardroom door began to rotate. It moved slowly, deliberately, the mechanics of the latch clicking with a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent room. The low hum of conversation that had been persisting among the board members died instantly. 12 men and women, captains of industry who controlled billions of dollars in capital, straightened their spines. I saw a few of them unconsciously reach up to adjust the knots of their silk ties or smooth the lapels of their jackets. It was a reflex, the body's way of preparing for judgment. At 11 o'clock exactly, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. I was not wearing a new outfit for the occasion. I was wearing the same black suit I had worn to the office 3 days a week for the past 5 years. It was an old suit, but it was tailored to perfection, fitting me like a second skin. There were no designer logos visible. I wore no jewelry other than a simple watch on my left wrist. Around my neck, hanging against the dark fabric of my blazer, was my company lanyard. The plastic card inside still read Ross, Brooklyn, Advisor. I must have looked underwhelming to anyone who did not know the context. I looked normal. I looked like the woman who usually sat in the corner taking minutes, and that was exactly why my presence was sucking the oxygen out of the room. I did not pause at the threshold. I did not look around the room to seek approval or gauge the temperature. I did not make eye contact with the investors who had ignored my emails for years. I walked in a straight line, my heels making a rhythmic, sharp sound on the hardwood floor. Click, click, click. I walked past the side chairs where Brielle Lockwood was standing, frozen like a statue in her cream-colored suit. I could feel her eyes on me, wide and terrified, but I did not turn my head. She was irrelevant now. She was a ghost in the room she thought she owned. I walked past Graham Lockwood. I could smell the faint scent of grass and mud coming from his clothes, a testament to his panic. He was staring at the table, his shoulders hunched, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. I reached the head of the table. The empty chair waited there, the leather pristine. The brass nameplate that the assistant had placed moments ago glinted under the recessed lighting. Brooklyn Ross, majority shareholder. I stood behind the chair. I did not sit down. I placed my leather folder on the table. I did not slam it. I set it down with a gentle, controlled motion. I unbuttoned my blazer and rested my hands on the edge of the table, leaning forward slightly. I want to pause here and tell you something. This was not the first time I had stood in this room. For 20 years, I had been in this room almost every month. But in the past, I was the shadow. I stood against the back wall, holding binders for Graham. I watched them vote on acquisitions I had vetted. I watched them approve bonuses I had calculated. I watched them laugh and drink scotch and make decisions that affected thousands of lives, all while treating me like part of the drywall. They spoke freely in front of me because they did not think I was listening. They thought I was just the help. They forgot that the help has the keys to every room in the house. I opened the folder. The paper inside was crisp and white. I looked up, scanning the faces of the 12 board members. They were all looking at me now. There was no dismissal in their eyes today. There was only fear and calculation. I began to speak. My voice was not loud. I did not need to shout. The acoustics of the room carried every syllable clearly. As majority shareholder of Halcyon Meridian Tech, I said, Holding 72.04% of the voting control, I move that all C-suite appointments made in the last 48 hours be rescinded pending a formal board review. The words fell onto the table like stones. They were heavy, solid, and undeniable. Usually, in a board meeting, a motion like that would spark debate. There would be arguments about procedure, about precedent, about the best interests of the company. Today, there was silence. No one could argue. The math was absolute. 72% is not a suggestion, it is a dictatorship. I looked at the board secretary, a woman named Ellen who had been with us for 15 years. She was already typing furiously, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. She nodded at me, confirming that the motion was entered into the record. I let the silence stretch. I wanted them to feel it. I looked down the length of the table at Graham. He still had not looked up. He was staring at his hands as if he had never seen them before. He knew that every appointment meant Brielle. He knew I was stripping her of her title in front of the entire leadership team. He said nothing. He did not defend her. He did not protest. He was a beaten man. My eyes shifted to the side of the room. Brielle was standing by the window. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her looking sickly pale. Her hands were gripping the back of one of the observer chairs. I could see her knuckles turning white from the pressure. She was holding on so tight it looked like she was trying to snap the wood. She was watching her career, her reputation, and her carefully curated narrative disintegrate in real time. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to speak, to object, to say that this was unfair. But she closed it again. She realized that in this room, fairness is determined by equity, and she had none. Next to Graham, Dylan was trying to make himself invisible. He had pushed his chair back slightly, distancing himself from his father. He had his hands under the table, but I could see the fabric of his suit jacket vibrating. His hands were shaking. He was terrified that I was going to say his name next. Harlan Price, the chairman, cleared his throat. He looked at the document in front of him, then up at me. His expression was professional, masked. He was a survivor. He knew that the power had shifted, and he was already aligning himself with the new gravity. "Motion received," Harlan said, his voice steady. "The board will proceed to private deliberation and vote on the motion." He looked at me, expecting me to leave. Standard protocol dictates that when a motion is brought by a shareholder, they step out of the room to allow the board to discuss the matter freely. It is a courtesy. It is a rule of etiquette. I did not move. I stood there, my hands still resting on the table, my eyes locked on Harlan's. "I will stay," I said. It was not a question. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Harlan hesitated. He looked around the table. He saw the other board members looking down, refusing to meet his gaze. He realized that the old rules of etiquette did not apply when the person standing at the head of the table owned 3/4 of the company. "Very well," Harlan said quietly. One of the board members, a man named Peter, who had always been polite to me in the elevator, gestured to the empty chair at the head of the table. "Please, Ms. Ross," Peter said, his voice deferential. "Would you like to sit in—" The room watched. They expected me to sit down. They expected me to claim the throne. They expected me to sink into the leather chair that Graham used to occupy, to physically replace him. I looked at the chair. It was large, expensive, and imposing. It was a symbol of the old halcyon, the halcyon of ego and appearances. I looked back at Peter. I stood up to my full height, smoothing the front of my jacket. "Not yet," I said. I remained standing. I did not need the chair. The chair was a prop for people who needed to feel important. I did not need to feel important. I was important. I did not need to sit at the table to prove I belonged there. I was the table. I stood at the head of the room, a solitary figure in a black suit, looming over the 12 most powerful people in the company. Behind me, the city skyline was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sprawling grid of steel and glass. But inside this room, the only structure that mattered was the one I had built, brick by brick, share by share, while they were busy looking at themselves in the mirror. The vote began. The boardroom emptied slowly, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. The lawyers had retreated to their corners to verify the obvious, and the board members had scattered to make frantic phone calls to their asset managers. That left just two people: Graham Lockwood and me. We moved into the small adjoining office, a space we used to call the War Room. In the early days, this was where we sat with pizza boxes and cheap beer, celebrating milestones. We had toasted to our first million in revenue here. We had toasted to the IPO here. It was a room designed for victory laps and bonus distributions. Today, the air in the room was stale, and there was no champagne. We were not here to share the spoils. We were here to carve up the carcass. Graham sat heavily on the small leather sofa. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. The mud on his golf shoes had dried and was flaking onto the carpet, but he did not seem to notice. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion that I had seen 1,000 times before, usually when he was avoiding a difficult decision. I never meant for it to get this far. "Brooklyn," he said. His voice was rough. I stood by the window, looking out at the city. I did not turn to face him immediately. I wanted him to sit with his discomfort. "We are family here," Graham continued, his tone shifting into that familiar, manipulative warmth he used on investors. "You have been with us since the garage. You practically raised Dylan. You cannot just blow it all up because of a misunderstanding. Brielle is young. She made a mistake. We can fix this." I turned around then. I walked to the small round table in the center of the room and sat down opposite him. I did not have any sympathy left in the tank. I had spent 20 years cleaning up after his family, and my severance package was an attempted public humiliation. "I am not interested in fixing feelings, Graham," I said calmly. "I am interested in resolving the capitalization table." I reached into my leather folder. I pulled out 2 single sheets of paper. I placed them on the table, face up, and slid them across to him. They moved with a soft hiss against the wood. "2 options," I said. Graham looked down. The paper on the left was titled Buyout Proposal. It was a simple document. It outlined a scenario where the company would purchase my entire stake, all 72.04% of the voting stock, at a premium. The price was set at 10 times the current valuation. It was an astronomical number, a figure that would require Halcyon to leverage every asset it owned and take on massive debt. But in exchange, I would walk away. I would resign. I would sign a non-disparagement agreement. I would disappear. No lawsuits, no public battle, just a clean, expensive exit. The paper on the right was titled A Reorganization Terms. This document was different. In this scenario, I kept my shares. I assumed the role of executive chairwoman permanently. It outlined a complete forensic audit of all company assets. It called for the immediate removal of all honorary titles, specifically targeting family members who held positions without qualifications. It mandated the termination of the Chief Vision Officer role. It established a new governance committee that reported directly to me, bypassing the CEO. It was not just a restructure, it was a purge. Graham read the numbers on the left. His eyes widened. Then he read the terms on the right. His face paled. He looked up at me, genuine shock in his eyes. "You would really walk away?" he asked. He sounded hurt. It was almost funny. He had just spent the morning letting his daughter-in-law try to fire me, yet the idea that I would voluntarily leave seemed to offend him. "After everything you built," he asked, "you would just take the check and leave. This is your life's work. Brooklyn, you built this place." I leaned back in my chair. I looked at him with a clarity that he clearly found unsettling. "I built the wiring. Graham," I said, "I did not build the wallpaper." He frowned, not understanding. "I built the legal structures," I explained. "I built the tax shelters. I built the compliance engine. I built the things that make the machine run. I can build those things anywhere. I can walk down the street to your biggest competitor and build them a better engine in 6 months. This building, the logo, the family portraits in the hallway, that is just wallpaper. I do not care about the wallpaper." Graham shook his head. "But the company..." The company is broken, I interrupted. It can either be fixed or it can be sold. Those are your choices. He looked back at the papers. He reached out a trembling hand toward the document on the right, the reorganization plan. I cannot sign this, he whispered. You are asking me to fire my own son. You are asking me to humiliate Brielle. She is family. What will I tell them at Thanksgiving? What will Wall Street say if we purge the Lockwood name from the leadership? He looked at me with desperate eyes. Think about the future of the family. Brooklyn. They are the legacy. I laughed then. It was a short, dry sound. You keep talking about legacy. Graham, you keep talking about protecting the children. Do you remember the night you signed Clause 27B? He blinked. He looked confused. I remember it. I said, it was raining. You were tired. Your nephew Julian had just tried to destroy the legal department because he did not like the font on a contract. You looked at me, Graham, and you told me you were terrified. I leaned forward. You said, and I quote, make sure the kids do not burn the house down. You signed that clause not because you wanted to give me power. You signed it because deep down, you know exactly who they are. You know Dylan is weak. You know Brielle is a tourist. You signed that death warrant for your own authority because you knew that one day they would do exactly what they did this morning. Graham looked down at the table. He could not meet my eyes. He knew I was right. He had created the trap himself, driven by the subconscious knowledge that his bloodline was not competent enough to manage his empire. I stood up. I smoothed my skirt. I am not the villain here. Graham, I said, I am the fail-safe mechanism you installed and forgot about. I looked at the watch on my wrist. You have 24 hours, I said. He looked up, startled. 24 hours. At 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, the buyout offer expires. I said, if you do not have a counter-signature on that left sheet by then, it is off the table. I will withdraw the offer to sell, and then only the reorganization remains. I will dismantle the nepotism piece by piece, and I will do it publicly in the boardroom. I turned toward the door. Brooklyn, wait, he called out. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. He looked at the two papers. His hand hovered over the buyout proposal. It was the easy way out. It would bankrupt the company's future cash flow, but it would save his ego. It would save his son's job. It would keep the peace at home. But then his hand pulled back. He was a founder. After all, the idea of paying me 10 times the value, of admitting that I had won so completely, was a bitter pill. I walked out of the room. I closed the door softly behind me. Through the frosted glass, I could see his silhouette. He was sitting alone in the war room, staring at 2 pieces of paper that represented the sum total of his failures. For 20 years, Graham Lockwood walked through these halls thinking he was the emperor because he held the scepter. He was just realizing now, in the silence of that small room, that he had never actually held the keys to the kingdom. I left him there to decide which limb he wanted to cut off to save the body. The next morning, the sun rose over the city with the same indifferent brightness as it had the day before. But inside the Halcyon Meridian Tech Tower, the atmosphere had shifted completely. At exactly 7 in the morning, a single email landed in the inboxes of every executive, director, and vice president in the company. There was no subject line with emojis. There was no inspirational quote in the footer. There was no company logo. It read simply, Emergency Transition Briefing. Mandatory attendance. All executive leadership. 9 in the morning, Boardroom A. There was no sender name attached, just the automated system notification. At 8:55 in the morning, Brielle Lockwood arrived at the building. She looked nothing like the vibrant, camera-ready woman who had marched in 24 hours earlier. She was wearing a slate-gray blazer that seemed too big for her, and her hair was pulled back in a severe, messy bun. There was no phone in her hand. There was no vlog recording her outfit of the day. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, darting nervously around the lobby as if she expected the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She walked to the security turnstiles, keeping her head down. She pulled her keycard from her purse, the same card she had used yesterday to access the private elevator. She tapped it against the reader. The light turned red. A low mechanical buzz signaled denial. She tapped it again, harder this time. Red light. She looked up, panic rising in her chest. The same security guard who had escorted me out yesterday was standing at the console. He did not smile. He did not salute. He stepped out from behind the desk, his hands clasped professionally behind his back. "Ms. Lockwood," he said, his voice polite but firm, "your credentials have been suspended pending the transition meeting." Brielle stared at him, her mouth opening slightly. "But I am the Chief Vision Officer," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I have a meeting at 9. The guard shook his head slightly. "We have been instructed to escort you to the boardroom to collect your personal effects," he said. "Please follow me." He gestured for her to pass through the manual gate. As she walked through, she looked up at the massive LED wall behind the reception desk. Yesterday, it had been cycling through the company values. Today, it displayed a single, static organizational chart. At the top of the pyramid, the box for Chief Executive Officer was grayed out. Above it, in bold white letters, was a new title that had never existed on the public screen before. Executive Chairwoman, appointed by majority shareholder. There was no photo yet, just a silhouette, but the name next to it was not Lockwood. Brielle stared at it for a second too long before the guard gently cleared his throat, urging her toward the elevators. She stepped inside, the metal doors closing on the last image of her family's legacy being overwritten by digital text. At 9 o'clock sharp, the boardroom was full. The composition of the room had changed drastically overnight. The Chief Inspiration Officer was not there. The Vice President of Culture and Vibes was missing. The three cousins who held vague consulting titles in the marketing department were absent. The room was populated only by the people who actually kept the company alive: the head of engineering, the VP of sales, the compliance director, the chief financial officer, and the general counsel. The air was thick with tension. Everyone sat straight in their chairs. There were no side conversations. At the head of the table, Graham Lockwood's leather chair was empty. There was no coffee cup. There was no notepad. There was only a single sheet of paper. Folded once, sitting in the center of the place setting, it was a letter of resignation. At 9:01, I walked in. I did not pause at the door. I did not wait for an introduction. I walked straight to the head of the table, to the empty chair that had been occupied by a Lockwood since the day the company was incorporated. I pulled it back. I sat down. I placed my hands on the table. I looked around the room. I made eye contact with every single person there. They looked back with a mixture of fear and respect. They knew exactly why I was sitting there. Harlan Price, the chairman, stood up from his seat to my right. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at a document in his hands. The board, by majority vote, has approved the reorganization terms submitted by the majority shareholder, Harlan announced, his voice echoing in the silence. Effective immediately. Ms. Brooklyn Ross is the executive chairwoman of Halcyon Meridian Tech. All executive authority now resides with the chairwoman's office. He sat down. I nodded to the general counsel. "Read the dissolution list," I said quietly. The lawyer stood up. He held a list that was 3 pages long. He began to read, his voice monotone and clinical. Effective immediately. The following roles are dissolved due to redundancy and lack of operational necessity: Chief Inspiration Officer, Senior VP of Brand Synergy, Director of Familial Relations. He paused for a fraction of a second, then read the next line. Chief Vision Officer. Brielle, who was standing by the door with the security guard, let out a small, involuntary gasp. The lawyer did not look at her. He continued reading. The list went on, stripping away every layer of nepotism and vanity that had clogged the arteries of the company for the last decade. It was not an insult. It was just facts being read into the record. When he finished, the room was silent again. I leaned forward. I did not raise my voice. This company has spent 10 years worrying about its image. I said, that ends today. We are going to undergo a comprehensive forensic audit of every department. We are canceling the lobby renovation. We are canceling the private jet lease. We are terminating all vendor contracts with entities owned by family members of the executive team. I paused. I looked at the CFO. And regarding my equity, I continued. The room held its breath. They expected me to hoard it. They expected me to consolidate my power until I was untouchable. I am transferring 15% of my holding into a new employee ownership trust. I said, the dividends from that trust will be distributed to all staff members below the VP level, based on tenure. A murmur of shock went through the room. The head of engineering looked at me with wide eyes. We need to stabilize the foundation. I said, the people who build the wiring deserve to own a piece of the house. That is how we ensure this company survives the next 20 years. I stood up. Meeting adjourned, I said. The executives stood up, scrambling to get back to their desks, eager to prove their worth in the new regime. I turned toward the door. Brielle was still standing there. The security guard was holding a small cardboard box. She looked at me. Her face was pale, stripped of all the arrogance she had worn yesterday. She was holding her personal cell phone and a tube of lipstick. She looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, then back at me. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. I walked past her. I did not stop to lecture her. I did not stop to tell her that she was the one who had triggered the clause. I did not tell her that if she had just been kind, if she had just done the job instead of playing the role, she might still be here. I walked out into the hallway. Brielle followed, flanked by security. As we walked down the long corridor toward the elevators, we passed the wall where the portraits of the Lockwood family had hung for 2 decades. They were gone. The frames had been removed early that morning by facilities management. All that remained were the faint, rectangular outlines on the paint where the sun had not faded the color, and the small, jagged holes from the nails. They looked like scars. I did not look up at the empty wall. I kept my eyes forward, focused on the work that needed to be done. On my first day back, they fired the advisor they thought was disposable. In the 60 seconds it took to read a clause they had signed and never understood, I fired their entire legacy. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment down below sharing your location and your thoughts on Brooklyn's revenge. If you enjoyed seeing the House of Cards fall, please make sure to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the world.